They call me Earl McKenna. Been married to the sea for going on 60 years now, and she's a hard mistress. She's given me everything I own and tried to take it all back more times than I can count. My face is a road map of that life, etched by sun, and my hands are gnarled as old driftwood, but they still know the feel of a good line and the heft full net. I've seen things out on that endless blue canvas, things that city folk with their bright lights and loud noises would call tall tales. But the ocean, she doesn't tell tales. She just keeps her secrets, and once in a while, she lets you peek at. This is the story of one of those peaks, a story I've kept under my hat for a long, long time. The old sea serpent, my trawler, she's not, I'll grant you. Her paint is peeling like a sunburned tourist, and she groans in a heavy swell like an old man getting out of a comfortable chair. But her hull is sound, built from oak, probably a sapling when my own grandfather was a boy. And her engine? Well, her engine personality. It's a cantankerous old diesel, but I know it's every cough and sputter. We understand each other, that boat and I. We've been through enough squalls, lean seasons to be family. This particular trip, I was chasing a ghost, a rumor, really, passed from one grizzled fisherman to another in a hushed tone over lukewarm coffee at the dockside diner. A silver tide, they called it, a massive school of mackerel bigger than anyone had seen in a decade, running deep in the offshore canyons, far from the usual grounds. Most of the younger fellas, with their sonar and fancy GPS charts, they dismissed it. Old men's dream, one of them had chuckled, not thinking I could hear. But I knew better. The ocean doesn't always show up on a screen. Sometimes you have to listen to her whisper, and those whispers come through old men who've spent a lifetime learning her language. So I went, pushed the sea serpent farther out than I had in years, into a patch of ocean marked on my paper charts with nothing but a depth number, a faded pencil notation, Good Cod, 1978. The first day was a bust. The second day, the same, just the endless rhythmic rise and fall of the gray water, the lonely cry of a gull, and the steady thrum of my engine. Martha, God rest her soul, she would have called me a stubborn old fool, and she'd have been right. Stubbornness is what fills the nets when luck takes a holiday. It was on the third night that the world changed. The sun went down in a blaze of orange and purple, a spectacular farewell that promised a calm night. And it was calm, too calm. The sea flattened out into a sheet of polished obsidian, mirroring the first stars that pricked the darkening sky. The usual slap of waves against the hull softened to a gentle lapping, then to nothing at all. The air grew heavy, damp and cold, and then the fog rolled in. This wasn't your everyday coastal mist that burns off with the morning sun. This deep sea fog, thick as unshorn wool, a blindfold on the world. It came silently, swallowing the stars, the horizon, and eventually the bow of my own boat. The deck lights cast a pathetic, fuzzy glow that didn't penetrate more than 10 feet. The sound of my own breathing seemed unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. The fog didn't just block your sight. It felt like it was absorbing all sound. The familiar drone of the diesel was muffled, flattened, as if the fog was thick blanket smothering it. I cut the engine. The silence that followed was absolute, a profound quiet I hadn't felt in all my years. It was the kind of quiet that makes you think you're the last man on earth. I made myself a mug of hot coffee in the galley, the metallic scrape of the spoon against the ceramic sounding like a gunshot. I stood in the wheelhouse, sipping the scalding liquid. My world shrunk to a tiny circle of dim light, surrounded by an impenetrable wall of gray. There's a loneliness that comes with a life at sea, but this was different. This was isolation, a feeling of being utterly and completely disconnected from everything. That's when it happened. It wasn't a crash. It wasn't a sharp, splintering crack like hitting a rock. It was a deep, resonant thump that seemed to come from everywhere at once. A solid, heavy impact that vibrated through the hull, up the soles of my boots and into my bones. The whole boat shuddered, a long, sickening jolt that sent my coffee mug flying from my hand to shatter on the deck. I was thrown against the chart table, the wind knocked out of me. For a second, just hung there, gasping, my mind racing. Submerged container, sleeping whale. My first thought was logical deadhead, a big waterlogged tree trunk floating just beneath the surface. They're a sailor's nightmare, especially at night in fog like this. Damnation, I muttered, my voice hoarse. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I grabbed the big handheld spotlight, its beam a poor weapon against the suffocating fog, and stumbled out onto the deck. The air was thick, the smell of salt and something else, something ancient and briny, like the bottom of the ocean itself. I leaned over the portside gunwale where the impact had felt strongest and swept the light back and forth across the dark, still water. Nothing, just the glassy surface, disturbed only by the ripples from my own boat. I cursed my luck. Whatever it was probably gone, drifted back into the gloom. A deadhead could punch a hole in your hull without you even knowing it until you felt the water around your ankle. I had to check for damage, but as I held the light steady, sweeping it in a slow arc, something caught the edge of the beam. It was pale, bone white in the yellow light, and it was long. My first thought was that it was the log I'd imagined bleached by the sun and sea, but it wasn't right. It wasn't smooth. It was segmented, lumpy. I moved the light along its length, and it just kept going, running parallel to my boat. I saw a knob, a ridge, then another and another, a repeating pattern like vertebrae. The image flashed in my mind, unbidden and terrifying. The spine of some colossal creature, dredged up from a forgotten age. It was massive. I could only see a fraction of it, but what I saw was easily the length of my boat, and it vanished into the fog at both ends. It was pale, almost luminous, and it seemed to suck the light out of my spotlight. My blood ran cold. My breath hitched in my throat. This was no log. A log is dead wood. This thing, it felt different. It felt ancient. As I watched, paralyzed, the section I was illuminating began to sink. It didn't drift away. It submerged with a slow, deliberate grace, slipping beneath the black water without a splash, as if the ocean was reclaiming it. In seconds, it was gone. I stood there for a long time, the spotlight beam trembling in my hand, pointing at nothing but dark water. I tried to reason with myself. It was the fog. The way the light plays tricks in a fog like this, it can make a man see monsters in driftwood. My eyes aren't what they used to be. It was just a strange-looking log, maybe a string of old buoys tangled together. It had to be. I was an old man, alone, in a fog thicker than chowder. My mind was playing tricks on me, but as I tried to convince myself, a shiver worked its way up my spine that had nothing to do with the cold night air. The thump hadn't felt like wood. Wood is buoyant, it gives a little. This had felt solid, heavy, like hitting a pier made of bone. Shaking my head, trying to clear it of the impossible image, I made a decision. There was no sailing in this blindness. I wasn't going to risk hitting that thing or whatever it was. Again, I went to the bow, the anchor chain rattling loudly in the unnatural stillness, and let it drop. The heavy iron plunged into the unseen depths, and the chain followed, link by rattling link, until it went slack. The sea serpent was secure, or at least it was stationary. I told myself I'd assess the damage in the morning, when the fog lifted, when I could see. I went back to the wheelhouse, locked the door, and sat in the dark, listening to a silence that was no longer empty. It was a waiting silence, and I felt, with a certainty that chilled me to my very soul, that I was not alone in that fog. Sleep doesn't come easy when you're an old man, and it's downright impossible when you think you've seen a ghost skeleton. I spent most of the night in the wheelhouse chair, my old shotgun resting across my lap. I don't know what I thought I was going to do with it. Shoot fog bank? It was a flimsy comfort, a familiar weight in a world that had suddenly become unfamiliar. Every creak of the hull, every soft gurgle of water sent a jolt through me. I was a stranger on my own boat. Dawn, when it came, was a disappointment. It wasn't a sunrise. It was just slow gray dilution of the blackness. The fog hadn't lifted. If anything, it had settled in for a long stay, like an unwelcome relative. It clung to the boat in a cold, damp embrace, dripping from the rigging and turning the deck slick, treacherous. The world was still no bigger than 100 feet in any direction. I felt a profound weariness settle into my bones, the kind that has little to do with lack of sleep. The first thing I did was try the radio, a fisherman's tether to the world. I flicked the switch, turned the dial. Nothing, just a blast of static, a dead, white noise that was somehow more unnerving than the silence. I tried every channel, even the emergency frequencies. It was like shouting into a feather pillow. The fog was eating the signal, smothering it. A deep knot of unease tightened his stomach. Next, I checked the compass. The needle had pointed me home 1,000 times, spinning lazily, a dancer without a partner, completely useless. It was as if the magnetic north had simply packed up and left. I made a pot of coffee, going through the motions to keep my hands busy, to pretend this was just another morning. But as I stood there, waiting for the water to percolate, I noticed it, a vibration. It wasn't the familiar shudder of the generator or the rumble of a distant ship. This was a low, resonant hum, so deep you felt it more than you heard it. It was a thrumming that vibrated right up from the soles of my feet, through the deck, into the very timbers of the sea serpent. I put my hand flat on the galley countertop and could feel the faint, steady pulse. It was the kind of frequency you feel in your teeth, a bass note played on some colossal, unseen instrument. And it was steady, constant, an organic rhythm that seemed to be coming from the water itself. I stepped outside, the coffee forgotten. The air was frigid, far colder than it should have been for this time of year. My breath plumed in front of me in a thick white cloud. I looked over the side. The water, usually a dark, lively gray-green, was black, still as ink, and it was empty, utterly, unnervingly empty. No gulls circled overhead, hoping for scraps. No curious seals popped their heads up. No sign of the small fish that usually darted around the hull. The ocean, which should have been teeming with life, was a dead, sterile void. The hum seemed to be the only living thing for miles. Me, as my eyes adjusted to the gloom, something else, faint, ghostly trails of light dancing in the depths, phosphorescent, bioluminescent. I'd seen it 1,000 times, but never like this. These weren't the random sparkles of agitated plankton. These were deliberate, swirling patterns, long, sinuous ribbons of pale green and blue light moving with purpose deep beneath the boat. They would trace a slow, elegant circle around the sea surface, then dive deep until they vanished, only to reappear on the other side. It was beautiful, terrifying sort of, like watching the ghosts of serpents waltzing in a graveyard. The hum seemed to sync with their movements, growing infinitesimally louder. The light swirled closer. Enough was enough. I was a sitting duck. Fog or no fog, I had to get out of here. This place felt wrong, tainted. I went to the engine room, the hum vibrating stronger through the steel plates of the floor. I said a little prayer to the cantankerous diesel, a silent plea for it to do its one job. I went through the starting sequence, my hands moving with the familiarity of decades. I turned the starter whined, a pathetic, high-pitched cry that was swallowed by the deep hum from outside. The engine coughed once, a sickly, wet sound, and then fell silent. I tried again. Whine, sputter, silent. A cold sweat broke out on my brow. That engine had never failed me. Not in a hurricane off the Cape, not when I was iced up and limping back to port. It had always started. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to claw its way up my throat. I fought it down. A man who panics at sea is a man who dies at sea. There had to be a reason. Fuel line, A blockage? I grabbed my tools and a flashlight, determined to find a logical explanation to wrestle this nightmare back into the realm of the ordinary. As I worked, checking filters and lines, I decided I needed to get a look at the hull. That thump last night, maybe it had knocked something loose. Maybe the propeller or the rudder was fouled. Pulling on my overalls, I got the small inflatable dinghy I kept for emergencies and lowered it into the water. It felt like a toy boat next to the sea serpent. The hum was palpable out here, a physical pressure against my ears. The water was shockingly cold as I leaned over the dinghy, my flashlight cutting a weak cone into the black depth. I pulled to the port side, to the spot of the impact, and then I saw them. The fog was so thick that I had to put my face right next to the hull. My light played over the familiar worn wood, and there they were, a series of long, deep gouges starting just below the waterline and running for a good 20 feet. My heart sank, but as I looked closer, the knot in my stomach tightened into a ball of ice. These weren't the splintery, jagged tears that a log would make. These were smooth, deep, and perfectly curved, like something had raked the boat with gigantic claws. There were 4 of them, running parallel to each other, and inside the grooves, where the wood was scraped raw, there was a fine, chalky white residue. I touched it with my finger. It crumbled like dry plastic, like bone dust. I paddled along the length of my light, trembling. They were undeniably made by something organic, something hard and skeletal. The image of the pale, segmented spine from last night burned its way back into my mind, no longer a trick of the light, but a horrifying certainty. As if summoned by the thought, the hum intensified. The water next to my tiny dinghy began to bulge upwards, not with splash, with a slow and awful inevitability, a mountain being born. The bone broke the surface. It was closer, so much closer. I could have reached out and touched. The denial I had clung to all night and morning shattered into a million pieces. Spine, a colossal articulated spine, each vertebra the size of an oil drum, knobbed and ridged with age. Water streamed from the ancient bleached bone, 1,000 tiny water. It wasn't just bone. Could see remnants of what looked like cartilage, dried sinew in the joints between the segments, a ghostly gray against the white. And it moved. It flexed with a slow, serpentine grace, a living, breathing fossil from a time before man ever dreamed of building a boat. I could see more of it this time. It stretched out into the gray mist in both directions, far beyond my sight, 50 feet. It had to be twice that, maybe 3 times. It was a creature made only of a backbone, skeletal leviathan swimming in a dead sea. The pale, phosphorescent lights I had seen earlier now clung to it, outlining its impossible length in the murky depths. I was completely paralyzed, my hand frozen on the paddle, my breath caught in my chest. The creature, moved slowly alongside my boat, its immense length passing by my little dinghy. It didn't seem aggressive. It seemed curious. The deep, resonant hum pulsed through me, a form of communication I could feel but not comprehend. And in that moment, stared at that impossible living skeleton, a final, terrible realization dawned on me. The thump in the night, the jolt that had knocked my coffee from my hand, it hadn't been an accident. It wasn't a collision. It was a knock on the door, and I had answered. The world shrank to the space between me and the creature. My dinghy bobbed like a cork in its silent wake. The shotgun in the wheelhouse, the useless radio, the miles of ocean that separated me from shore, none of it mattered. All that existed was the cold air, the gray fog, and the impossible reality of the skeletal titan gliding beside. Fear is a funny thing. There's the sharp, frantic fear that makes you run or fight. Then there's a deeper, colder fear, a fear that freezes you solid, an awe-filled terror that comes when you realize just small and insignificant your grand scheme of. That's what I felt. I was a mouse watching an eagle circle over. The long white spine continued its slow, deliberate passage. It wasn't just a bare-boned skeleton. Here and there, Tattered remnants of something dark and leathery, like ancient hide, clung to the vertebrae. It was an undead thing, a living fossil that had no business being in my world. The low hum it emitted seemed to change in pitch as it moved, as if it was scanning me. The dinghy, the sea serpent. My entire life I'd believed I understood the ocean. I knew her moods, or currents, or creatures. I'd read the books, studied the chart. But the creature in front of me wasn't in any of them. This was from a different book entirely, one written in a language of deep time and crushing pressure, a book's cover I was only now glimpsing. It circled the sea serpent once, its immense length carving a slow, hypnotic path through the black water. The phosphorescent trails followed it like a royal entourage. I just sat there in the dinghy, watching. My panic had burned itself out, leaving behind strange, hollow clarity. I was at its mercy. Any sudden move, any sign of aggression from this impossible beast, and my boat would be kindling, my life a mere footnote in its ancient existence. It had disabled my boat not with malice, but perhaps with a casual nudge, the way a man might accidentally kick over an anthill without even noticing. My thoughts turned to Martha. I pictured her face, the way she'd smile when I came home, reeking of salt and fish, but with a full hold. I thought of the life we'd built, the quiet years, a good life. If this was to be the end, adrift in a silent fog in the company of a sea monster's ghost, then so be it. But something inside me, that stubborn fisherman's grit that Martha used to call my mule-headedness, refused to just give up. This wasn't a monster to be fought. It was a power to be respected. An elder with movements that felt slow and heavy, as if I were moving through water myself. I paddled the dinghy back to the sea serpent and clumsily pulled myself aboard. My legs were trembling, and I had to lean against the gunwale for a moment to steady myself. The creature was still there, a pale, ghostly ribbon circling, waiting, watching. What does one do when faced with the impossible? You fall back what you know, and what I knew was the unspoken rule of give and take. You don't take from the ocean without giving something back. It's a balance, an offer. I went to the fish hole. The catch from the previous days was meager, but it was there, packed in ice. I rummaged around until I found the best of them all, a magnificent cod, thick-bodied and silver, nearly 3 feet long. It was a prime fish, the kind that would have fetched a pretty price back at the market. It represented a day's hard work, fuel, and hope. It was the best I had to offer. Holding the heavy, cold fish in my hands, I walked to the edge of the deck. The great spine was on its pass by the starboard side, closer than ever. The deep hum vibrated through the air, a question being asked in a language I couldn't speak. I looked at the cod, then at the impulsive creature. "All right, old-timer," I whispered, my voice a dry croak. "You win. This is your water." It wasn't a prayer, not really. It was an acknowledgment, a gesture of a concession from one old fisherman to something infinitely older. With all my strength, I heaved the big cod over the side. It hit the water with a dull splash. It sounded like a cannon shot in profound silence. For a moment, floated there, a silver slash, black. The circling stopped. The immense skeletal form grew still in the water. The hum faltered, quieted, leaving an even deeper, more profound silence. A section of the spine, the part closest to the fish, slowly began to submerge. It didn't go for the cod. It simply sank, vertebra by silent vertebra, slipping beneath the surface with a final, deliberate gray. The pale, ghostly lights that had danced in the depths flickered and then went out, one by one, as if someone had blown out a string of candles. In less than a minute, it was gone. I stood at the rail for a long time, staring at the spot where it had vanished. The cod I had thrown overboard was gone too, though I hadn't seen a thing take it. The water was just black, empty, and still. Was it trade? A tribute accepted? I would never know. I stood there for what felt like hours. though it was probably only minutes, lost in a daze. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, a change, a gentle breeze. The first I'd felt all day touched my cheek. The oppressive weight of the fog seemed to lift. Patches of gray began to thin, revealing darker water below. A lone gull cried out in the distance, the sound sharp and clear and wonderfully, blessedly normal. I stumbled back to the wheelhouse, my heart daring to hope. I looked at the compass. The needle had stopped its lazy dance. It quivered for a moment and then locked firmly onto north. With a trembling hand, I reached for the radio and flicked it on. A voice, crackly and laced with static, but a human voice, was in the middle of a weather report. Visibility improving to 1 nautical mile as the unexpected fog bank dissipates. A sob of relief, ragged and harsh, escaped my throat. I practically ran to the engine room. I didn't bother checking anything else. I just turned the key. The starter whined. The engine coughed, sputtered once, twice, and then roared to life with a cloud of black smoke, its familiar deafening rumble, the most beautiful music I had ever heard. The fog continued to burn away under a sun I could now feel, but not yet see. The world was returning. As I steered the sea serpent on a course for home, I looked back one last time. The water was empty. The air was clear. It was as if the whole thing had been a dream, a hallucination brought on by solitude and fog. But I knew it. The deep, curved gouges in my hull and the memory of that ancient, impossible spine were etched forever into my boat. I never told anyone at the dock, really. I just said I hit a submerged log that fouled my engine. They nodded, swapped their own stories of close calls. Some things the ocean shows you for a reason. And it's not always for you to share. It's to remind you that for all our nets and engines and fancy electronics, we are just guests out here, floating on the thin skin of a world we can never truly know. Humility before the vast, unknowable mysteries of nature is the greatest wisdom. We are not masters of this world, but merely temporary guests, and respect for the unknown is paramount to survival. If these memories from the deep resonate with you, I'd be honored if you'd subscribe to the channel. There are many more tides to explore together.